Okay, today I'm going to read from this book, America on the Couch by Pythia Peay, and I'm going to read the 31st interview, which is in this book, and it's entitled American Zeitgeist and a Shift in Ages, an interview with James Hillman, PhD. Hi, Penelope, welcome. I'm going to zip through this because I have to go see a doctor. Nothing serious, but nonetheless. So, world-renowned as a thinker and post-Jungian psychologist on the human psyche and an array of topics from animals to dreams to cities, James Hillman absolutely loved to talk politics, and I love to talk politics with him. Because of his lively imagination, coupled with a keen intellect, I could always count on Hillman to espy the particular angle on a current issue that no one else saw. It was always as if he was gifted with a kind of archetypal second sight. I could also count on Hillman to unsettle whatever comfortable habits of thought or opinion I'd drifted into. An interview with him was something akin to bungee jumping or skydiving, and I had to prepare myself in advance for an adventure of the mind. Thanks, Penelope. Writers live by ideas, and in that regard, Hillman, a prolific author, possessed an enviable, luxurious excess, but he was no ivory tower thinker. Deeply immersed in the issues of the day, he was profoundly and personally affected by the twists and turns of current events, and both fascinated by and concerned about the effects of American culture on citizens' everyday lives. Hillman's keen interest in the interplay of culture and the psyche was shaped by early influences. His childhood growing up near the Atlantic City boardwalk in New Jersey in a family-owned Breakers Hotel, his time in the U.S. Navy Hospital Corps during World War II, where he experienced his first call to psychology. As an adult living abroad in Europe, earning his degrees and pursuing his training as a Jungian analyst, and his return from abroad to the States once again, living in Dallas, Texas, and lastly, in a small town in Connecticut. Though I had interviewed Hillman on the American psyche and other topics many times in the 1990s, years would pass before our interview in February 2011 for the Huffington Post. As it turned out, that was to be our last conversation. As he approached his 85th birthday, he was recuperating from 2 years of illness. It's a new life, he told me, a lot of reflection instead of ambition. His wonderful mind was soon engaged, and he spoke compellingly on the American zeitgeist and America's coming shift in ages. Hillman died on October 21st, 2011. Like many others, I continue to miss him greatly and often find myself wondering what he might think of this or that political issue. What would he see that everyone else was missing? I am grateful to be able to share our last interview and Hillman's typically unconventional vantage points on topics such as polarization, conservatives and liberals, and the Jungian idea of the opposites, as well as his thoughts on gun violence, wealth, President Obama, the failure of American exceptionalism, and his announcement of the death of certain abiding American myths. After I'd transcribed and written up our interview, Hillman reviewed it with me in a phone editing session with his well-honed writer's eye, changing this word and that phrase, leaving for the reader a kind of last tribute to his eagle mind. And here's the interview. And so the interview is between Pythia Peay and James Hillman. Peay. The Tucson shootings triggered a debate over the ongoing polarization of the right and the left. What is your psychological perspective on this? Hillman. We have to, oops. Lamp keeps blowing out on me. Hillman. We have to realize that our minds are our enemy. The current debate has become very ideological, with certain fixed ideas dominating the discussion. This is a result of thinking in opposites. It goes back to the Greek philosopher Aristotle and has to do with an either-or kind of logic. If something is this way, it cannot be that way. But this isn't how the world really is. For example, most people think that the opposite of white is black, but there are shades of black, from blackberries to black coal to black birds, that have nothing to do with white. The point is to learn how to evaluate each issue on its own merits without having to bring up the opposition's point of view. In therapy, when you have a dream of your mother, for example, you don't necessarily have to talk about your father as a supposed opposite. Peay. In other words, a conservative or liberal will often have a predictable reaction to a specific issue. But in therapy, an important part of the psychological process involves examining how we think. We seem to be saying that we need more of this kind of critical examination in our political process. Hillman. I agree, for instance, with some of the extreme propositions from both parties. On the left, I think we should make extreme cuts to the defense budget. On the right, I agree with the extreme proposition that we should close down the Department of Education because it's a total failure, and possibly agriculture too, since it's dominated by the agribusiness giants it's supposed to supervise. Peay. So by saying that you have radical views from both the left and the right, how does this address the issue of polarization? Hillman. It addresses the issue by saying that a person doesn't have to cling to certain ideas just because they're on the left or the right. There are other ways of putting things together so they're not necessarily opposed. There is the idea of collaboration, or the phrase coterminous, meaning where one appears, the other has to appear. Chinese culture has the yin-yang symbol with its interwoven extremes. It seems to me that we lack this kind of complex imagery in the media. Television foments this by bringing two people together with opposing positions, as if every situation has just two sides. Peay. There is a growing weariness among the public with this kind of ideological boxing match. Hillman. Let me just check one thing here. Okay, going on. Hillman. Democrats and Republicans sitting side by side during the recent State of the Union address may have been a psychological breakthrough. Do you remember broadcast journalist Fred Friendly? He used to host a television show with Supreme Court justices, ambassadors, and intellectuals from the left and the right. He'd ask very tough questions that produced true intellectual discussion on current issues. That would be one example of how to handle differences without simplifying into polarities. A word, by the way, that comes straight out of electrical engineering. Okay, that's polarities he's talking about. A word, by the way, that comes straight out of electrical engineering. It's not a psychological term and doesn't help solve a problem for the psyche. as what is psychological isn't as rigid as scientific models of thinking. Peay. When it comes to handling polarized political viewpoints, I wonder what you think about Obama. Many on the left have a problem with Obama's temperament. They see him as weak when he's conciliatory to the Republicans' right. Hillman. Obama's temperament is a tremendous virtue. At least we have somebody who is cool-headed, who tries to think things through, who can take the pressure, and who can even concede having made a mistake. The speech he gave at the Tucson Memorial was a masterpiece. He walked right into the middle of all these conflicts and the problem of America, and he said something that had real content and was not sentimental. He did not use highly intellectual or rigid ideological language. By referencing the little girl who was shot and by encouraging us to live up to her expectations of our democracy, he was able to revitalize the American dream and engagement in political life through her own dream of becoming politically involved. And personally, I think the agreement Obama struck with the Republicans over the tax bill was clever. Peay. But many on the left faulted Obama for caving in on this issue. Was this an example of a fixed ideology at play in the political arena? Hillman. Yes, it's an ideological fixation for the left. We must not let the rich get richer. I'm all on the side of the ideological left, but on this issue, I think the left is wrong. Let the rich get their jillions. They're going to anyway. This is just how the situation is until the rich begin to convert on their own, like Warren Buffett and Bill Gates, who are now trying to change the minds of capitalists. And if the rich have more money because of the tax deal, let's appeal to their capacity of citizenship and hope that they find ways to help the country, whose condition affects them too. There are a lot of things we don't know about. That might be going on in the psyches of the super rich. Peay. You mean the rich may themselves be harboring new perspectives on their wealth? Hillman. Exactly. I can't imagine that the rich or the conservatives are utterly closed off from the changes going on in the collective psyche. But the ideological left locks us into a fixed view of the other. This traps them in having to be worse than they may possibly be. Peay. Are you saying that the liberals' fixed view of the right might actually be helping to create the enemy that they're locked in battle with? But isn't the right just as guilty in this as the left? Hillman. I'm not saying that there aren't some fanatical activists on the right, but I'm on the left, so I'm trying to bring more psychology to their situation. And the ideological left runs a danger of continually nailing the coffin on the enemy. By fixing the opponent, it puts them in a box and omits the possibility of the kind of transformation exemplified by John Dean, Nixon's lawyer, who then testified against him during the Watergate hearings. But if a political party is seen only this way or that way, then we prevent what else might possibly be going on in their psyches, and we're not bringing any insight to the process. For example, if I have a wife and I only see how mean-spirited and quick-tempered she is, and I see her that way all the time, then she becomes fixed into that character definition and nothing else. Peay. In using marriage as an example, you're implying a relationship. Does this mean that both the Democrats and the Republicans are overlooking the fact that they're in an intimate relationship instead of being unrelated strangers? I admit I feel that way sometimes when I listen to Glenn Beck. Hillman. It's clear every day that the left and the right are in a marriage. Fox News's Bill O'Reilly talked obsessively about MSNBC's Keith Olbermann, and Olbermann talked obsessively about O'Reilly. They were locked in a marriage. And for all that, the liberals want to mock Glenn Beck. He is talking about American history and political theory that the left neglects. Pay. I agree. But what you seem to be saying is that just as in therapy, there needs to be more reflection on the country's past. Hillman, even MSNBC is leaning forward, but I'd like to see it lean backward, which is what the word reflection means. What, for instance, is in the shadow of these fixed ideals? One thing that's being ignored is history. In a certain way, the liberal world has been lax about standing for true American history. I think of Howard Zinn and his leadership on this subject. Besides besides ignoring the past, what might be some other effects thinking in opposites has on our culture? Hillman, it leads to the extreme moralism in our society, which declares one side good and the other bad, and then the other becomes evil, all of which leads to conquest, warfare, victory, and those other destructive Western ideas. Pay. Indeed, one of the ongoing debates after the Tucson shootings was whether the climate of violent political rhetoric contributed to what happened. Hillman, my perspective on this is a little different. I think that this kid was made a loner by an American educational system in which there is no room for the weird or the odd. The moment Jared Lee Loughner began to become schizoid, isolated from society in class, he was thrown out. He became lost in the great Tucson mass of people. He wasn't being held by anything. Pay. So instead of political polarization or the lack of a stronger mental health system, you see this tragedy as related to our educational system. Hillman, we need to have an educational system that's able to embrace all sorts of minds and where a student doesn't have to fit into a certain mold of learning. Our educational system has become so narrowed to a certain formula that if you go through a weird phase, you're dropped out, often at the age of schizophrenia, 19 to 23, and that's the danger. And in addition to that problem, you've got the availability of guns and the pressure of a society that can't take the peculiar. But I can imagine that this young boy did not have to do this shooting. Pay. If you can imagine that this tragic shooting didn't have to happen, then what do you imagine might have happened instead? Hillman. He would not have been thrown out of school, and he would have spent some time with his teacher, who would have made an effort. We also need a kind of counselor who isn't tarred with the brush of making psychological assessments, and where he wouldn't have been cursed with the idea of insanity. Right there is an insult. Instead, we need a school counselor who is more like a wise man or woman and who would listen to a guy like this without pathologizing his concerns. The problem with the educational system is that it lacks love. Pay. You're talking about bringing back a person's humanity so that they aren't depersonalized, which only increases their marginalization. Hillman. Right. Instead of having that kind of discussion, we have a factual examination of the incident and talk about reducing the gun clips from 31 bullets to 10, but the boy himself is left out of the discussion. Pay. Here we are, this great country with all our emphasis on the individual, and yet we fail the individual. Hillman. Absolutely. The person becomes an oddball. a kind of isolate, cut off from everything. Pay. So this kind of psychological perspective on America's problems begins with more careful reflection. Hillman, and a little more curiosity about people and events, and we don't have that. We really don't. Pay. Earlier in our conversation, you said that America today has a certain tragic aspect. Can you say more about that? Hillman, everything that everyone is afraid of has already happened. The fragility of capitalism, which we don't want to admit, the loss of the empire of the United States, and American exceptionalism. In fact, American exceptionalism is that we are exceptionally backward in about 15 different categories, from education to infrastructure, but we're in the stage of denial. We want to reestablish things as they used to be to put the country back where it was. Pay. For many, those are fighting words. People don't want to question American exceptionalism because if America isn't exceptional, then what is it and what am I? Hillman, the capacity for people to kid themselves is huge. Living on illusions or delusions and the reestablishing of these illusions or delusions require a big effort to keep them from being seen through. But a very old idea is at work behind our current state of affairs, AntiOmiya, or the Greek notion of things turning into their opposite. It's said, for instance, that we're in a change of age, and as the ages change, those old things that seem to be great virtues suddenly become vices. The 2,000 years that preceded this was the great expansion of the West and the age of the greatest monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Yet these three salvational prophecies, with their tremendous aesthetic accomplishments and enormous civilizing effects, have turned into monsters in their self-absorption, with their righteousness and orthodoxies. They lack insight. All three claim to be the one. Pay. What would be another example of something turning into its opposite? Hillman, I would point to the great beliefs of secularism and humanism that began in the 17th century and even earlier. So as we see today with writers like Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins, the fourth religion is throwing out religion. This leaves us with a kind of barren scientism, or what religious people describe as a godless humanism. These are the great currents that are going on right now. People still want to find something further, but things haven't yet fully disintegrated. Pay. What you're saying is that these powerful myths that have defined America, the monotheistic religions, secularism, and our economic myths, have peaked and are in decay, but not quite. Hillman, yes, but it doesn't look that way. It looks like they're being powerfully reinforced, which is always a sign of lack of vitality. If they were vital, they wouldn't need to be defended. And the fanaticism we're witnessing goes along with the deterioration of the vitality of these myths. Pay. So when a society is trying to defend something this strongly, it's really a symptom of the decay that's going on beneath the surface. Hillman, right. Take, for example, the economic myth, the major myth that we live in the country, the major myth that we live in this country. Now, economists will all declare that the world problem today is the falling off of demand and that we must stimulate demand, whether by the government or through bank lending. But if you were to look at the problem of demand falling off from an ecological point of view, what could be better? Doesn't that show an extraordinary disruption between the kind of economic thinking that dominates our capitalist world, including China, and the Earth's point of view. But the ecological way of thinking creates a huge panic problem for capitalist economies. Pay. You mean because these societies sense that an old way of life is dying? Hillman. Exactly. Now there are plenty of intelligent people who are working on how to live in an economic no-growth society, and Obama has been very important in trying to bring new structural thought to these questions. But as long as the economists and the bankers rule, the old way will die very slowly. Pay. Still, the death of the old always implies that something new is coming. Hillman, in an exasperated tone. This looking for the new is an American vice. We always want to see what's coming next. We're addicted to the future. Futurism is another American myth. Whether Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Reagan, or Obama, American presidents all come into office with a new program and the conviction that the country is going to be better than ever. But I think you have to hasten the decay. The classic view is always to look back and to watch and help the dying. Pay. As I hear you speak, I'm thinking of how my family and I helped my father die, which was a very profound experience. And I'm wondering what a similar experience might mean in a cultural sense. Hillman. One would have to think about what needs to die in this culture. What attachments need to slip away, such as white supremacy, male supremacy, and the sense that we are really good people. America has a certain hubris about its virtue. Another thing would be our unanalyzed understanding of the word freedom. Probably one of the striking things in the dying of your father was his dependence on help, like nursing homes and nurses and crutches. Yet out of this lack of freedom arose another kind of freedom. Pay. My father was particularly stubbornly American in that regard. He wouldn't even go into the hospital. He wouldn't even go into the hospital because then he wouldn't be free to smoke or drink. But you seem to be saying that as we lose one kind of freedom, there arises the possibility of another kind of freedom. Hillman. I'm saying that we haven't thought about the idea of freedom enough. It needs to be internalized as an inner freedom from demand itself, the kind of freedom that comes when you're free from those compulsions to have and to own and to be someone. For example, think of the kind of freedom that Nelson Mandela must have experienced when he was imprisoned. He completely lost his freedom in the outer world, yet he found freedom within. That's an example that broadens our current limited idea of freedom, that I can do any goddamn thing I want that I can do any goddamn thing I want on my property, that I'm my own boss and don't want government interference, that I don't want anybody telling me what I can and can't do, that we've had too much regulation, and so on. This is the freedom of a teenage boy. Another strange aspect of this shift of ages is people's fear of getting cancer. It's absolutely endemic throughout the population. The healthcare bill stirred this up, and people began to wonder what would happen to them if they got cancer. Pay. Why do you take note of that? Hillman. Because it's more than simply the fear of dying and the fear of disease. It's part of this period of things breaking down, and that it's only going to be a matter of time. Pay. It makes sense that people would have this fear because you're describing this huge cultural moment in which not just one myth, but also 3 or 4 of our most fundamental myths are all crumbling at once. And because most people don't have these changes put into a broader context, the way you're doing now, they're picking up the changes and feeling the anxiety. Hillman, they're feeling it personally only. Peay, so people are feeling this shift, sensing that things aren't going to be the same anymore, and this fear is making this whole process worse. Hillman, definitely. We see this conflict in the fear of immigrants and of our borders being transgressed. We're afraid of running out of all the things we're dependent upon, of losing power and our military bases all over the world, of our educational levels falling, and of America being the best and the strongest. But the point is, it's already collapsed. It's over with, and that's what's interesting. Peay, and why is this so interesting? Hillman, because once we understand what's really happening, we can see what else can emerge once the structures that are worn out finally crumble. There is a huge amount of stuff going on underneath these old forms. We don't know exactly what it is yet. It's all very different, unorganized. It doesn't coalesce, and it's diverse and dispersed. But it's very important that people take part in some of these emerging projects. Peay, can you give me some images or ideas of what you're talking about? Hillman, at a recent Bioneers conference, the environmentalist and entrepreneur Paul Hawken put up a film on the screen. It was simply a list of names of organizations who are doing inventive things all around the world, whether on trees, fisheries, rivers, different modalities of communities and economic systems, materials that don't use up scarce resources, people harnessing sea waves to escape from oil dependency, and endless other things. Hawkins said that he could let this roll for weeks and there would be thousands and thousands of names working on what's happening beneath the surface of society. Peay, but for many, the psychic atmosphere is so charged with a kind of floating fear and uncertainty that it's like being at sea in the middle of a terrible storm with no sense of direction. So the question becomes, how do we live during this shift between ages? Hillman, it's important to avoid wanting these innovative structures to conform to the models of the past. And that means unified, organized, and from the top down. What's beginning to emerge is very different from what's gone before. We can't entirely eliminate things like hierarchy, but what's coming may have no tops or bottoms or even a name. Remember that in the early days of the feminist movement, they refused to have a leader. Different women would just stand up and speak. The early feminists were very careful to not put what was spontaneously arising back in the old bottle. So I think it's a matter of being freewheeling and trusting that the emerging cosmos will come out on its own and shape itself as it comes. This means living in a certain open space, and that's freedom. Okay, so I've been reading from an essay between Pythia Peay and James Hillman, which is the 31st essay appearing in this book, America on the Couch, by Pythia Peay. And in this book, Pythia conducted a series of interviews with various Jungian analysts around the world. And so now I have to excuse myself, but I hope this has been a useful conversation today.